Welcome to the Online Church Devotional Series, where we cover the entire Bible in 20 minutes. Well, today's chapters are 1 Chronicles 26 and 27. Now, I'm at that stage of life where I've got some children and they're busy getting married, and I'm certain that I'm going to be a grandfather in the not too distant future. And so from this vantage point, I look down through and over my family and I ask questions like, God, why did you put them in my life? Some of you might be too young to have children like this, but God puts people in your life. I mean, I'm standing next to Sue's favorite little family tree thing here. This accounts for all the birthdays of the various people in our family. And she prays over these people and sends messages to these family members of ours. God's put people in your life. Why? I have a lot of friends whose children are distressing them. Maybe they've slacked off on what God called them to. Maybe some of them have even turned their back on God. I've got a lot of friends like that. And so what's our role, especially when our children maybe start to live lives that we don't think is best for them? Well, our roles are to present Jesus to them and to pray for them. They're unique. We can create space for them. We can, applaud them in their pursuits. But essentially, our role is to love them, to present Jesus to them, and pray for them, and trust that God has His way in their lives. So this list is quite fascinating. It's a list of all the significant people in David's life and their children, what their children got up to. So what Asaph's kids got up to. Obadiah, remember that guy who loved the presence of God, who had the ark at his house, what he got up to. The people's children who looked after the treasury, and those who became officials and judges in the house of Israel. So I trust that as you read this chapter, your mind maybe goes to the people God's put in your life. Let's pray for them today. Let's trust. Maybe some of them even need a phone call. Maybe some of them need a text to encourage them in the things that God has called them to. Now, the next chapter, we get an insight into David's strategic mind. It's like his organogram of the significant officials that he packed around himself. And we can't help reading, when we read this, the enormous capacity of this man. Remember, he didn't have social media. He didn't have TV. I mean, he had to administrate hands-on and trust good men and women around him to relay messages and to organize things. There was a young guy gave me a phone call the other day. I was at school with my son, wanting to pull out of university, and just wanted my perspective on it. You see, he'd started a little business, and he said, listen, I've started this little business. Why am I wasting my time at university? I took him to this story of David, and I said, King David led an incredible army, an incredible kingdom, with great skill and finesse and incredible heart. And he did it because God increased his capacity when he was a young man. You see, he was a shepherd for his dad, and then he was called to the king Saul's courts to play a harp for him, and then he had to run back and help his dad, and then he was given an army to look after by Saul, and then he had to play the harp, then he had to look after his dad, and he had to juggle his complicated brothers. And so while he was a young guy, he was loaded with lots of plates to spin, and as he spun those plates, his capacity grew. So I said to this young guy, listen, there's nothing wrong with starting a business while you're at university. And God is busy increasing your capacity, growing your capacity, so like David, you can walk into that which he has for you. Look at what David used to do. He had officers commanding hundreds and fifties, and then each division of 24,000 men, he had different guys leading every month. He would rotate them. Imagine rotating your leadership monthly to give guys rests. He had this guy, Benai, who was in charge of his mighty men. He had 30 crack troops, I suppose, like the Marines, like the SS. And then he had significant armor bearers around him. He had different leaders of the tribes of Israel, like the statesmen of Israel. In addition to that, he had someone in charge of the different storehouses in the outlying districts, in the royal storehouse. He had in charge of those who worked in his land. He had foremen in charge of his workers. He had someone in charge of his vineyards, in charge of the produce in the vineyards, in charge of the olive trees and the sycamores and the supply of olive, in charge of those in charge of herding and the grazing, those in charge of the camels, those in charge of the donkeys, those in charge of the flocks, those in charge of his property portfolio. The stewardship is astonishing. Then you ask the question, well, how did he keep this going? Well, for a big, strong alpha male like this, he had people around him that kept his head on his shoulders, wise decision making, increased his capacity. Listen to this. His uncle was a counselor of him. He had great insight and was a scribe, used to write for David. Then he had someone looking after his sons. He had people helping him raise his boys. And then he had a king's counselor, someone who would deal with royal affairs. Then he had a confidant who was just the king's friend. For a big, strong man like this, he understood he needed people to help him on what God had called him to. Well, fascinating 2 chapters today. God bless you.